Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. I think I should start.
Okay.
Hi everyone, welcome to my channel, New Directions in Leadership, and we will talk about different historical periods and their impacts on leadership. And the program is called Married Minds, and I am with my husband Ted Kohn. We had to we had to take a break sometime, but we are back, and that's why we are having three different episodes this week, and we will catch up with you. Today, we will talk about ancient Greeks and their civilization and all the things they left us. And those things help us to define leadership practices and leadership mindset. So let's start with talking about ancient Greece and like a general overview. And like, can you just picture us those times?
Yeah, I mean, if I think about ancient times, there's one factor that impacts, I think, absolutely everything, and that's the Mediterranean. So if you're Spain, south of France, Italy, Greece, the Middle East, Egypt, North Africa, you're engaging in a massive, what at that point was global trade that was never seen before. So you're talking fruit, fish, wine, dyes, and this creates a tremendous amount of wealth that feeds into the power of Rome, the power of the Greek cities, North Africa, eventually Macedonia. And so when we think about some of the maybe cultural and artistic, things, inventions that come out of that time, I think a lot of it's probably fueled by this kind of newfound wealth, right? The Mediterranean means an exchange of ideas and an exchange of wealth.
Mhm. So for the first time, like kind of we didn't talk about this in Egyptian civilization or a prehistoric time. For the first time, you mentioned about trading, right? So most of the time, other civilization they just stay where they are and they start farming other things, but they were always doing things the land they were on. So for the first time, Greeks start trading with other people and they learn, they exchange information and knowledge too. So do you think trade really affect Greek civilization and all the things they've built?
Yeah, I think so. I think the exchange of ideas has always been one of the most kind of profound catalysts for invention. So, I think ahead 1,000 years or so, and I think about Mecca, right? Mecca was a trading post that brought together, right, Jews and Christians, and Islam is, an amalgamation of a lot of these ideas. So I think absolutely some of the greatest creations that came out of Greece, I think one of the things probably we're not going to talk about is like mathematics, right? The Greeks are really they laid the foundation for mathematics as a field. I'm sure this was because of, first of all, astronomy and having to, guide themselves on the water, but also exchanges with North Africa, with Spain, with the what became the Roman Empire, and the Italian city states of like Rome and Venice.
They have also colonies, right? They don't only like trade and meet with people, but actually they colonize. So do you think colonization is more affecting than trading in terms of exchanging ideas, or they have similar impacts?
No, I think they have similar impacts because they both mean kind of an interchange of ideas. And when we're talking about, kind of ancient Rome, we go towards the Roman Empire. So something kind of writ large on, a European and Eurasian scale. But when we're talking about Greece at this time, we're still talking about city states, Athens, the polis, Athens, Sparta, Delphi, Syracuse. So they have very, they jealously guard their identities, which a lot of us probably know from from movies, right? Sparta with a
Mm.
warrior class, and Athens as a seat of culture and literature and philosophy. Delphi has the oracle, like from the Matrix, but and they fight each other, like in the Peloponnesian Wars, right? Very, very famous. But they also come together sometimes to fight other people, like the Macedonian Empire, much later the Ottoman Empire. But at this point, there's still very specific kind of entities, and but they share a lot, right? They share a language, they share the gods and mythology. But the idea that they would naturally come together into something we'd recognize as like a nation, that's really it's really almost like a 19th century idea, that, well, why didn't they come together? Why wouldn't they be a greater people and have a Greek empire to rival the Roman Empire, to rival the Macedonian Empire? Why were they part of the Ottoman Empire? But that's a notion that really is much more kind of modern, I think.
And also being a community in those times based on the land, right? So there's no, now we said I'm a citizen because of the like bloodline, or like America, it is still land based,
land,
right?
language, right? Again, like 19th century, the Civil War, American Civil War, it ends in 1865. Well, I mean, that was a war really of kind of national unification. 2 years later was, we saw Italian unification. We saw Prussian unification at the end of the Russo-Prussian War. We saw the Meiji Restoration in Japan. I think that was 1867. Canadian Confederation in 1867. So this idea of, well, we have common language, common history, common land, that makes us a single entity. That's actually a fairly recent idea.
So all this like different time periods, but especially ancient times, when we talk about power and governance, most of the time it is centralized. I think ancient Greek is the only unique one which has like city-states. Do you think it is unique for them, or it's just based on the geography or the needs? Because they are different city-states, because they have to create this collaboration and also bargaining, right? And compromise. This is important. All the things they've built through their civilization. So what do you think about it? Because we will not see this in ancient China, or we didn't see it Egypt, or we will not see it until federation, like until what? 19th, 20th century?
So I mean, I think there's other kind of similar models out there. So I think, Italy did have, Rome was one center, Florence was a center, Venice was a center. Going ahead, you often had provinces. Some of the empires that you're talking about, like even in the Roman Empire, I mean, you had provinces as far away as England. They had governors, right, who were linked to the emperor, but were pretty autonomous. And then what's interesting, I think, about later colonization, you think about the American colonies, right? There was no Central American colony government. Each of the 13 colonies had a direct link, not with each other, right? New York didn't have with Pennsylvania, but all the way back to London. So I think that's kind of in many ways, that's a key of colonization as well. You don't want to foster that kind of interrelation, because once they start having interrelation and exchange of ideas, then they come to see themselves as, for instance, a Greek people or an American people, right? You want to have that direct loyalty and link with the central power. But that's not to say that distant, far-flung governors of a province or of a colony didn't have quite a deal of autonomy, because of course they would have to have, if it takes weeks for a message to get from the metropolis of an empire out to the farthest parts of the empire.
So it's a good point that how unique they are, but at the same time how similar they are with other communities or other civilizations. So I want to start with my pick, so you can just rest a little bit. I know you did quite a bit talking. my mind works like with questions. So when I ask questions, I can like really understand everything we discuss in a better way. So if I ask too much questions, just let me know. But there will be
Never.
more questions. I can just warn you. So I pick. Which I think will make you happy, because I picked the beginning of a history.
Oh, okay.
So,
Didn't think to pick that.
yeah, by then, of course, history writing is not like now. It
Mhm.
wasn't scientific, right? It is more than writing narratives. And in the history books, Herodotus is the father of the history. And although people who came after him and wrote history, they call them the biggest liar,
Mhm.
because apparently Herodotus has this idea of, okay, I will talk about wars, I will talk about real events, but I will add things from my imagination and I will make them more readable, or like people will like it more. That's why when Greek people started focusing on writing history in a better way, they said that, oh, Herodotus was like totally lying about everything. But he started because before him, no one was recording the real events. Yeah, there was a myth, like people were telling stories. They were like routines and rituals about religion. So they were creating that kind of narratives, but nobody before him wrote the real events and talk about those events. So he did a really pretty important thing to me, because when I look at his way of explaining real events, now I can see in modern leadership is the narrative control.
Mhm.
So whoever controls the narrative gets more power.
Yep.
And become a leader.
Yeah.
And we can see it like 19th century, right? World War One, World War Two, each one has their own narratives, right? And although history became scientific field, still most of the leaders, especially imperial age and during the war, still history is used to support leaders or dominant classes power. So what do you think about it?
No, I completely agree. And if you hadn't said the phrase, the person who controls the narrative, the person who controls history has all the power. And, it's happening today, right? Look at the debates that are going on in the States over what can be taught in the classroom. And that what a incredibly great example of what you're trying to say. People get it, right? People get that controlling the history feeds into a person's power, but it can also take away other groups of people's power. So, are we telling the story of, visible minorities, of what African Americans have gone through, of what Native Americans have gone through, of what Asian Americans have gone through, members of the LGBTQ community? So, is history in many ways kind of like a finite pie, and the less you tell of somebody's story, the more you're telling of other people's story, or vice versa. And that's certainly, I think, the way a lot of political leaders in the United States interpreted. Oh my gosh, right? All the founding fathers were white men. Well, yeah, but that doesn't mean that they were the only people that existed. Or the thing I like about history is that it's a very broad and very deep field and should be as inclusive as possible. But I think that's absolutely it. Leaders have sought to rewrite history for their own power. And some of the worst leaders that we've seen, right? I mean, like Stalin, literally erasing people out of photographs in the history books because that was a way to, coalesce and enshrine his power. So this is it. I don't know. Perhaps the first leader, maybe it's somebody that used Herodotus for for the Greeks, right? Because he's the one who wrote about the Peloponnesian
Yeah, he is.
Wars,
Yeah.
right? So I mean, maybe it was a Greek leader who first, garnered this idea. But I completely agree that this has been a constant throughout human history.
Yeah, and of course, Herodotus write that Greeks are like heroes.
Yeah.
They win. They were so powerful, and people who were having the I don't think so. Yes, there are some kind of reality in your narrative, but not like 100%. That's why, although again in the book, most of the books we say that Herodotus is the father of history. I prefer saying again like recording narrative because it is not still the history we are thinking and talking about. And he is very important to me in terms of leadership because before him in like other periods, even in Egyptian era, there was a past events recording, but
Right.
it was for gods.
Mm-hmm.
So kings or leaders used to write like a yearly narrative or all the things, almost like a diary,
Mhm.
but they were using it to confess or to show how much they are good as a individual human to their God. So yeah, there was a recording past events, but for a holy reason. For the first time, Herodotus opened the door to use this to control public. So that's why he is very important because before him, nobody realized, oh, wait a minute, we send our leaders to war. Nobody knows what happened because nobody's telling afterwards.
Right.
And then suddenly, people were writing about it and leaders, oh yeah, did you see, I did all of this, I'm a hero, I save you. So I think most important thing of Herodotus, he kind of without knowing or with knowing started telling and writing the narrative, telling the narrative to control people. So that's why I think it is very important. And as you mentioned, we still current leaders, again I will say with knowing or without knowing, they still do this. So
Yeah, and it's funny because I think before we've talked about like the great man theory of history, right? Is it a great man who forms history, or does history form the man? Does he come out of a certain context? That's the only reason he becomes a great man. So I think that's what I was thinking about as you were talking about Herodotus, because wars and nation building and the men responsible for that, I mean, that's basically what history is pretty much until like the 20th century, right? You say, oh, I'm a historian. You didn't get a PhD in history, right? You sat down with a bunch of other people's books and papers, and you wrote another biography of George Washington, another biography of Lincoln. You did another history of the Revolutionary War, or the War of 1812, or the Civil War. So the fact that that's what he started, but it actually, that's the way the field of history as it was, that's the way it lasted for thousands of years, right? As you said, history, it's a scientific field. It's a social science. So you have a hypothesis, you look at evidence, and you interpret the evidence. But that notion, and that you need also perhaps a PhD or an MA or a special training to do that, it's a very, very like 20th century notion. So it's really amazing how things stayed the same for thousands of years in my field of history. It's only been the last 100 years or so that it's changed.
Yeah, that's why I like oral history projects, because it really gives the perspective of a real human or real individuals who really lived that period and lived that events. Not someone is being objective or subjective, writing the same, but you can see, or like social history, right? Which those fields give us how real people felt by the time the events are happening. But again, Herodotus started a huge, powerful tool for leadership, and it evolved, it changed, and now we say something else, not history like Greeks named him like a historian, but now we are talking about narrative building or
Mhm.
storytelling, or sometimes the creating all us feeling, like controlling the
Mhm.
emotions. So these are still important. So what was your pick, or what is your pick?
So my pick, and I had a feeling we were going to pick the same thing. So it's interesting. You picked history, and I picked. So I picked democracy, right? Like Athens as the birthplace of what we'd still recognize as democracy. And we look at the way democracy has evolved, changed, what it looks like today. But we can think about what our previous two episodes were talking about, like gods as leaders. And I assume we're going to talk later about medieval, right? The appointees of gods as leaders. And now suddenly we have this notion in really ancient times that the people, that the citizens, the mob, demos, the people, actually have a say in running not a whole country at this point, like we've talked about, but a say in who the rulers are, or a say in what the policy is. And then, I mean, you start thinking about the way that shapes history for the next, several thousand years. And I mean, you can speculate how that shaped leadership, because you would think that leadership in a democracy, or a republican democracy like the United States is, with an elected legislature, is very different than maybe even some of today's authoritarian countries, which maybe look more like ancient Egypt or something with a pharaoh.
And we saw this, right, during I don't want to remind anyone those times, but during pandemic COVID times, we saw this. There is a hidden fight between democracies and authoritarian regimes. Even in pandemic, they said some of the authoritarian was, oh, look, we control everything,
Right.
like that. Whatever we say, our citizen did, our numbers low. Look at all these democratic countries, they are still suffering because they cannot convince people to obey the rules, right? So for me, I think if there is a kind of a world war in the future, it will be between democracies and authoritarian regimes.
Yeah. No, it's I think you're right. It's interesting that we've seen, like, Vladimir Putin recently, he visits China, and he visits, North Korea, which is almost on the verge of being a failed state. And what's the message is that, it's not just about, military protection, but it's a message that this is the alternative to the world that's being created by America and the Western democracies, the world that really we've lived in since the end of World War II, the creation of the United Nations. In Paris now, they're celebrating 75 years of NATO, right? Bretton Woods agreement. We live in a world that's kind of created, I don't want to say like in America's image, because then we start thinking about like cultural imperialism and things, but that's the message coming from the other side, right? Democracies are weak. Democracies give too much freedom. Democracies are going to be failed states, because look at how the United States is being polarized. Look at the recent elections just yesterday in France, right, between the right and the left. That's what happens when you leave people to a democracy, right? Russia needs a czar again. China needs an emperor again. And as we've seen, even in the United States, even in Europe, there are a lot of people who are very sympathetic to that idea. Yeah, we need a strong man to be a strong country. And it's amazing how, people who have been reared on democracy, and I assume learning about the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, and all men are created equal and one person, one vote, have this kind of leaning towards authoritarian tendencies. That that's somehow a better system, because democracy can't be trusted, because the people can't be trusted, and we need someone strong, to lead us through the difficult times. It's interesting how that persists even in countries that I would consider a strong democracy.
And also, this concept has evolved, because when we talk about Greek democracy, we are not talking about one vote equals
Yeah.
one person. So when you say, oh, Greek citizens can be part of the democracy as a woman, I
Right.
have to
Yeah.
say that
Or
not all.
slaves.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So who are the
Right.
citizen? Who were the citizen for
Yeah.
Greek?
I mean, it's very similar to like we were just talking about, like the founding fathers who actually had the vote when we first had a country, right? It was landholders. That's what gave you citizenship, because you had a stake in the community. Women, slaves, laborers, of course, they don't. Children, yeah, again, good
They
point. They
weren't
don't. Yes,
citizens.
yeah, they're not citizens. They don't have a stake. So you're right. It's a very proto-democratic idea that springs forth, and even the founding of the United States, you have to go through a lot of constitutional amendments and a civil war to get to the idea that other people need to have the vote, including women who don't get it until 1919, 1920.
And free men, and in Greek times they were well educated.
Mhm.
So when we talk about democracy, their democracy was very different now we are having in our modern time. And for their time, the democracy they were using made leaders' job a little bit difficult, because they have to convince. They were senators, and all these people intellectually they were equal. So that's why there were lots of bargaining, and also they were just like changing the leaders so quickly. And now in our democracy, these are very different. But as you said, it's the first thing they did to rule their community, and they created a new system. So it is important. But if we talk about their democracy and our democracy in terms of leadership perspective, do you see any other differences that we haven't touched
Yeah, I mean,
on?
just the one thing I was thinking of is, I'm not sure there was a Greek constitution, right? So we have a constitution, and so that's supposed to be a framework of laws. And it also doesn't mean that, well, it's the people have a say, so you get 51% of the vote, you can do whatever you want, right? The majority isn't always right, is the way the American system is set up, right? That's why the first 10 amendments of the Constitution are the Bill of Rights, because you bet the founding fathers were very frightened of rule by the mob, right? That you get any despot gets 51% of the vote and they can do whatever they want. No, right? The rights, religious rights, right to freedom of speech, yes, the right to bear arms. So, I mean, I think that's very key too, that when you're thinking about democracy, I think one of the things that probably gives the opponents of democracy pause is that it sometimes seems like a mobocracy, or that it's a rule by the majority, and the majority can then, that 51% can persecute and prosecute that 49% whenever they want to. But I think that's why you have a constitution, why you have a rule of law, and why you have laws and rights and amendments that protect the rights of minorities.
Yeah. So one thing I will add to do this, I just want to be a little bit devil's advocate. So the real democracy is everybody, or supposed to be, everybody is being part of the system, right? Everybody has a voice. The democracy in modern times we are using it based on representation.
Yeah.
So people choose in most of the democratic countries other people who can represent them in the parliament or in the governmental system. And instead of choosing the most educated, most intellectual, right, really idealistic people, all the history shows us that people have a tendency to vote or to choose to represent themselves people like them.
Yeah.
And it makes democracy a little bit challenging, because the people they send to the parliament or the ruling system is not really democracy is looking for. So do you think it's a dilemma, or how, like, we can, of course, I know you cannot bring every single person and just like be part of the system, but the quality of the people who are belong to ruling
Mhm,
class is getting low and low, and they become more populistic. That's why you gave the example of France.
mhm.
That's the great, most of the Europe now, they are kind of captured by populist leaders,
Yep.
right? So do you think it's a dilemma, or it's just a very natural evolution of the
No,
democratic system?
I think it's a dilemma. I think in the United States, a lot of it has to do with money. We were talking about Congress people in the United States. They have to run for reelection every 2 years, which means on the first day of
Yeah.
office, you need to be raising money. That's what you're spending the most time doing. You make a lot of personal sacrifices to serve, and probably in terms of like privacy, in terms of being away from your family. So you probably have to have a bit of narcissism in you to say that, oh yeah, absolutely, I'm best to be in this position in Congress and Senate and in the presidency. So it probably, there's a bit of self-selection going
Yeah.
on. I think that probably, a certain kind of person is drawn maybe to power, and less to service. And the polls show, even in the United States, in the 1960s, the number of college graduates interested in doing going to some kind of public service, serving the country, serving the community, was, like 60, 70%. 50, 60 years later, it's, way down into like the teens and 20s. So, I mean, our students themselves don't see that as an attractive path anymore. And we could also talk about that. Is that a cultural shift about us being more individualistic, having other distractions? So I think it is a dilemma. You're not necessarily looking to serve the community as much as you're perhaps looking to serve yourself. That's a
Mhm.
shame.
Yeah, and at the end, whoever controls the narrative
There you go. I agree.
controls everything
Mhm.
around themselves. So I don't know in our conversation who controls the narrative, or maybe we have a democratic
I think she
we
does.
have
That's
a
okay.
democratic
That's fine.
like
You have a
conversation.
happy
So
life. Yeah.
you represent yourself, I represented myself, so
Okay.
I think it was a
This
good
pure
yeah.
democracy of two people. All
Yeah,
right.
exactly.
Good.
Yeah, if there are two people, it is
Mhm.
easier, right? So anything you wanna add?
No, I think that was great.
Yeah. Good. So again, you can just go and like read about this time period, ancient Greece, and you can pick your own incidents or events or concepts, and you can share those findings with us. So until tomorrow,
Yes.
which we will talk about ancient China. Take care, and thank you for watching us.
All right.
Bye.
Thanks.